On here Ed Brundick, but I think it might be Johnny Carson. So if you were here a couple of weeks ago or a month ago when he did it, I couldn't quit laughing. Now I watched him on tape, but if you haven't seen him, go to our website, and in the left upper corner it says YouTube, and we put all these on YouTube, so they're on these. Everybody's filming it, but he's on the YouTube, and you need to watch him about what he talked about Vietnam vets that had orthopedic problems that were up in Denver. It teaches you a lot about Denver. Ike having a heart attack, other things. So this Dr. Brundick, I've worked with him for years. He did wear his uniform last time. He's making us look bad because I think the only people in the room is Dr. Myers can fit in his uniform. I can't fit in my uniform. I'm glad he didn't wear his uniform today, Ed, to make me feel better. My wife tells me to go on a diet, and I do at 8 o'clock in the morning. By 9 o'clock, I've broken that diet. He graduated from the University of Kansas. We just came back, about 14 of us, to the museum, and you can join our museum to do this. We went on a tour of Kansas City, and we went to see World War I museum, maybe Earhart's museum, Truman's site, and then the Leavenworth Museum. So we had a great time. 14 of us brought some knowledge back, and hopefully it doesn't leave our brains very quickly. He graduated at University of Missouri, that's Mizzou, University of Missouri Medical School of Medicine, orthopedic surgeon Fitzsimmons. And if you listen to that tape, he talks a lot about Fitzsimmons. He's was a doctor in the United States Air Force, and he's got tons of good experiences, and he's going to tell about one of them down where all of you were aware of Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. He'll go over those things. And when we were growing up, we paid attention because Kennedy said he's going to put people on the moon, and I thought he was not telling the truth, but he was telling the truth. Then he's stationed at Patrick Air Force Base, Cape Canaveral. That's still a big base down there. Got a lot going on. And then he came back here to Evansville in 71. He's worked here as orthopedic surgeon for 48 years. So that's longer than a lot of people live. So we're lucky to have him here. And I'm telling you, he's a good speaker. And Johnny Carson always do this golf shot. Take it away, Johnny. Take it away.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it. So what we're going to talk about today is rockets and risk takers. And before I go any further, I'd like to thank my two daughters. They are absolute specialists on this kind of thing. So they've had a big hand in this. So with rockets, the thing I want to do is drop back just a little bit to when the father of rocketry, born in Germany, Werner von Braun, in 1912. And then we'll talk a little bit about what Werner Braun did with rockets in the Second World War. Where it went in the 1950s when we were in a space race with the USSR and they were winning. And then we'll get to Cape Canaveral when I was stationed there in 62, 63, and 64. It was a very exciting place to be. It was kind of like you were standing in history. You knew it was being made, so you just asked all the questions you could and tried to do everything you could possibly do. And then we'll end up with Neil Armstrong stepping onto Tranquility Base on the moon in July of 1969. So now regarding the risk takers, of course, are the astronauts. The first astronauts were all test pilots. And because Eisenhower said they should be test pilots, because he didn't want to start off at ground zero and teach these people everything. So you wonder, why would a guy sign up to get on the tip of an ICBM missile and be shot in space when it had never been done before? One of the reasons, these guys were used to taking risks. They were all test pilots, and then the statistics for test pilots in the 1950s is amazing. We lost test pilots at the rate of 1 per week. We lost 52 a year for 10 years. And now, to being a test pilot isn't near so risky, but it's because we can do so much ground training and we can do computer simulations. In those days, they simply had to get in the airplane and try it out. And they didn't want them to just fly around the flagpole. They wanted them to take it to the nth degree, and sometimes they would go past the nth degree and then they'd be dead. So the question about risk takers, do you think risk takers are made or are they born? That is this guy right, is this guy right here, did he used to be this guy right here? Is this guy going to be that guy? Did you have any kids who every time you looked the wrong way, they were jumping out of a tree or off the back of a couch with no fear of being hurt? And if you did, was that a little boy or a little girl? That is, if you think that this is genetic and you're born to be a risk taker, then there are some things like boldness, that are sex-linked, and that is it takes men only one gene to become bald, it takes women two. So maybe this little guy here, it only takes him one risk taker gene. So that if that's true, then there would be more boys and girl risk takers. So now here's what these guys signed up for. They signed up to get on the tip of this Atlas missile. Now, if they had been on that missile, they would have been in the water, obviously. So here's another failure. This was the Vanguard. This was a Navy rocket. And in the late 1950s, it was the odds-on favorite to become the dominant rocket and shoot people to the moon. The failure rate was so high with that eventually they had to give it up. They had one series of Vanguards that they called the Blue Angel series, and that was supposed to be about 11 shots. They didn't get to 11, they only got about to 7 or 8, and they had to stop it because the Vanguard failed in an interesting way. It didn't blow up on the pad like that one's doing. It would go out over the Atlantic Ocean and do a 180 and coming right back at you. And so, they were able to successfully detonate every one of those in the sky, and the parts fell in the Atlantic Ocean. But the thing that people lived around there worried about is what happens if the detonator doesn't work, and it comes back and lands on the Cape, it lands on Patrick Air Force Base, or if it just goes 50 miles inland, it lands on Orlando. By the way, what was the population of Orlando in 1960? 250,000. That was before Disney. It was amazing how small it was. So anyway, did we have a disaster plan? I was part of a 14-physician group stationed at Patrick Air Force Base, and if there was a disaster, we were supposed to handle it. Did we have a disaster plan? The answer, yes, we did. I'd been there about 3 or 4 months, and the hospital commander came in and put a book on my desk. It looked like about a 2-inch old telephone book. And he said, "Get familiar with this." And I said, "Yes, sir." And so I read about the top inch, and it was almost unreadable and didn't seem applicable to our situation at all. So I'd been through disaster practices before at other places. So I didn't read the last inch. Well, God punishes such things, so we had a disaster. And what the disaster was as follows. There was an ugly building on the Cape called the Block Building, B-L-O-C-K. And it was made out of blocks. But it was unusual in that the walls were all 3 feet reinforced thick. The roof was reinforced thick, and there were no windows. So what they used that for was to static fire the engines. So all the engines you see out on the pad fire up, they have previously been fired up in the block building. Static means they don't move, so they got them bolted down. Well, they were static firing a Delta engine. The Delta engine is the one the CIA used in their secret shots to try to put satellite missiles in the sky. Well, the Delta engine came loose and flopped around inside the building. It couldn't get out of the building because of 3 feet reinforced walls, so 7 technicians got seriously burned. They all showed up on our doorstep at the same time. Hospital commander walks in and says, "Activate the disaster plan." I think out of our 14 physicians, we had about 10 there. Everybody just stood there. And I think the hospital commander, his job only was to say, "Activate the disaster plan." And he thought we were all going to do it. So we stood there for an uncomfortable length of time, probably 2 minutes. And then finally some physician, not me, I wish it would have been, said, "Let's put 1 physician, 1 corpsman, and 1 nurse on every patient," which is what we did. And then it worked. But what would have happened if we would have had 70 casualties, 700 casualties, or 7,000 casualties? All those numbers were very possible. Clearly, we didn't have a way to take care of those. So when I was in disaster plans practices before, you'd have a practice, and then you'd be critiqued individually, and the plan would be critiqued. So I thought after this, there's going to be a bloodletting meeting after this. There was no meeting at all. And we didn't have a practice before that at all either, which is kind of funny that a tremendously risky place you wouldn't practice your disaster plan. And I think the reason we didn't practice is because how do you practice taking care of 7,000 casualties? I think it was just so intimidating that we just let it slide like everything worked just fine. So now we're going to start off talking about rockets. The father of rocketry is this guy right here, Werner von Braun. He was born in Germany in 1912. And in the Second World War, he was their chief rocketeer, and he was the foremost rocketeer in the world by far. And his number one thing he built during the Second World War was the V2. Was that V2 right there. The V, he said, stands for vengeance. And he launched that against London, Antwerp, and Paris after the Germans had been driven out of Paris and Antwerp, but to get even with us bombing the German cities. And that was a nice justification on his part, because he killed 5,000 Londoners. But he said, the reason I did that is because you're bombing our city. But he'd been working on that for 12 years. So I don't know where he was going to use it if he didn't use it on someplace like London. It was the first man-made object that went into space. It was the first man-made object that broke the speed of sound. So that when it came down in London, there was no sound. It was just suddenly dead people. So at the end of the Second War, he and his brother Magnus were trying to decide, they knew that people would want them. It was clear that rocketry was a thing of the future. And so they were trying to decide, do we want to be captured by the USSR or do we want to be captured by the Americans? Well, they decided the Americans. So they arranged to be captured. And so Magnus, as a matter of fact, his brother rode out to the American lines on a bicycle so he wouldn't appear threatening with a picture of his brother saying, do you want to capture this guy? So they did. So they took him back to where they were building these rockets in a place called Pidi Mundi, and they said, we'll take you and anybody you need to make your rockets. He identified 1,600 people, and they brought all those back, plus their families, because they weren't going back, so it made 6,000 people we brought over and put them in Fort Bliss, Texas. And they were there until 1950. So, now, from 1945, when Werner got there to 1950, we didn't give him anything to do anything with. He did three things. He lectured American engineers on how to build rockets. He wrote a book, and he wrote several papers. Besides that, nothing. He said that he was a prisoner of peace. He wasn't a prisoner of war. He was living good, but he wouldn't do what he wanted to do, was build rockets. 1950, we moved the whole thing to Huntsville, Alabama, in a place called Redstone Arsenal. Then we began moving up just a little bit. But in 1952, 7 years after we got him here, there was the Congress had a meeting, a committee, to decide where we wanted to go on our rocket program. So it was virtually 7 years wasted. So in 1957, we got a big eye-opener because we got Sputnik 1 was going over the Earth. Sputnik is Russia for satellite. So they had this satellite, and that satellite weighs 184 pounds. They had to have a rocket with enough thrust to get 184 pounds orbiting. And we didn't have anything like that. So they had passed us. We got the A team out of Pidi Mundi, and Russia came in after 2 or 3 weeks. They got the B team. The B team had beaten the A team because we didn't give the A team anything to work with. That was visible by the naked eye when it was on the far east or far west horizons of the country. The sun would shine on it, and you look at a little star. And then it made beeping noise emanated by these things, which if you had a hearing device, you could hear that. So here's Sputnik 2. They launched that only 30 days later. That also was frightening, the fact that they could do that twice, that quickly together. That dog Laika was in it, and Laika made 4 trips around the Earth. The first 2, Laika was alive. The second 2, Laika was dead because the air conditioning system failed. But the thing about it is, you knew if they were orbiting a dog, soon they'd be orbiting a man. And of course they did. A guy by the name of Yuri Gagarin. So we tried to save face. So 1 year later, 1958, we launched Explorer 1. Explorer 1 weighed 30 pounds and 8 ounces. So that was only 1/6 of the weight of what they launched. So that was all the thrust we had, 1/6. But it was a good launch because this thing right here, that's what they launched. There was a guy by the name of James Van Allen who was an astrophysicist, a PhD astrophysicist at the University of Iowa. And he came up with this idea that some people thought was a harebrained idea, that there was a radiation belt around the world made up of electrons, protons, and alpha particles. And if you fly through those, you'd get irradiated. Any astronaut who wanted to go to the moon would get irradiated. This thing proved that was correct. And there's even a second, smaller one. And when the astronauts go to the moon, they do get irradiated. It's not much. It's about as much as a dental x-ray. But some of the instruments they have in there are so sensitive that they have to be protected. So now, USSR ahead of us, so Eisenhower, who a number of times demonstrated unusual common sense, said we need to get an civilian organization called NASA. And we had people working by this time, 1958, on space, but we had 4 space programs going. Air Force, Army, Navy, and CIA, and nobody would share any information with the other person, because if they told them about how they had a success or how they had a failure, it might give the other person one leg up, and maybe they would become dominant in space. So Eisenhower said, none of you should be dominant in space. Space should be civilian. So he started civilian NASA. So now we're going to put people in space. What shall we call them? Shall we just say people in space? So we had a meeting again, and we came up with the idea of the name astronauts, and the USSR came up with cosmonauts. Astro is a Greek word for stars or celestial body, and naut means sailor. So we're sailing to the stars. The USSR, they came up with the word cosmo, which means the entire universe, so they're sailors to the entire universe. So now we have a name. But what is an astronaut? Nobody had ever seen one before. So now we have another meeting. And these are the astronaut specifications this meeting came up with. They said no taller than 5 feet 11 inches tall. How did they come up with that number? They knew the diameter of the top of the Redstone rocket that they were going to use and the Atlas rocket they were going to use. It could be no wider than that. It could be no less than that. So then if they made a reasonable cone, they could tell how many square feet they had in there to fit somebody in. And that's the reason if you're over 5 foot 11, you couldn't fit in. Even then, John Glenn said, you don't get in a space capsule, you wear it. It was so tight. So now, 5 foot 11 inches tall, the USSR were more strict. They said 5'7", and they put a weight limit on 158 pounds. We didn't have a weight limit. So then they said no older than 39 years of age. Why was that? It takes about 2 years to get an astronaut up to par where he can function. Teach him all that stuff. So now those people would be 41. Now, if you're going to take 10 years to go to the moon, which we did, that makes that person 51. It takes 8 days to go to the moon and back, and most people 51 can't sit that long without moving their joints because almost everybody has a little arthritis. The next thing is, at this point, if you're short and relatively young, you're a candidate. So then Eisenhower steps in. He said they must be a graduate of test pilot school. He wanted them to have all that basic information. And so they added on graduate of test pilot school and have at least 1,500 hours as a test pilot. That limited the applications a lot. And then I heard that the meeting was over. And somebody said almost in passing, well, what about an education? So they said, oh yeah, college degree or the equivalent. See, that doesn't seem too impressive, does it? What kind of college degree? Could you be a PE major? Could you be a music major? Didn't say. Hey. Or the equivalent. So you didn't even have to graduate, and that helped John Glenn. John Glenn was a chemistry major at Muskegon University, but he only went 3 years. He dropped out to fly. So they waived him as equivalent for that. Otherwise, John Glenn wouldn't have been one. The college degree became very important later. And the reason is because guys like this, Gordon Cooper, who, by the way, is from Murray, Kentucky. He graduated from Murray, Kentucky High School. Both of his parents worked for the university there, Murray State. I don't know in what capacity. He didn't go to school there. He went to the Naval Academy and got a degree in aeronautical engineering. He was the youngest of the new astronauts at 31. But they noticed that guys like this who had an aeronautical degree, they were extremely valuable. Their opinion of why something worked or didn't work and what could be changed turned out that was pretty valuable. As a matter of fact, they even designed the interior of the Gemini and Apollo capsules. And now we've had 5 astronauts who have PhDs in aeronautical engineering from MIT. That's pretty strong. And one has a same degree from Stanford, which is strong, and we have a lot of them who have undergraduate degrees in that. So now here are the 7 original astronauts, and they were like movie stars. I don't know if you older people remember that, but they are movie stars. At Patrick Air Force Base, if we heard like John Grisham was over at the BX, everybody had passion with BX to see him. So they were only planned to be 6. But they couldn't decide between the last 2, so they just made it 7. So they announced and showed these people the first time at a press conference in Washington, D.C. in 1959, fall of 1959. None of these people had ever seen a rocket launch. They signed up to ride one, even though they had never seen one. So after that meeting was over, they put them in a bus, took them to Patrick Air Force Base. That's 5.5 miles south. So they put them in a bus, took them up and showed them. They had a missile all queued up and they're going to show them a missile shot. So they showed them, here's what they saw. The missile blew up. They were about a mile up, it blew up. And supposedly the people there, Alan Shepard, who was the first guy who went suborbitally in space, leaned over and said to John Glenn, who was the first guy who went orbitally, I'm glad they got that one out of the way. So this is me. This is 1959. This is kind of when I got in the picture, student and two, and I got this in the mail. Greetings. You are hereby ordered for induction into the Armed Services of the United States and report. So I've just been drafted. And I just wonder, how many of you in here have gotten that letter? Hold up your hand. I'd like to, yeah, it's a little jolt in it, no matter, you know. And so they had a program they called the Berry program. If you're a medical student and you didn't want to stop and start again, you could sign up for the Berry plan. You didn't get out of anything. You just delayed it. And it would work well for the governor because they got to use you then as a physician. But you could go in after medical school and a year of internship, and you'd go in what's called a GMO. That stands for General Medical Officer. That means that you are a family practitioner in the military. Or you could elect to, if you knew what specialty you want to go in, what residency, you could do that and go in as that specialty. So I elected to go in after internship because I didn't know what I wanted to do yet. And got a letter in the mail and said, you're in the United States Air Force. You know, if you're drafted, you don't get to say what you're going to be in. You don't get to say what your MOS is going to be. That stands for Military Occupational Specialty. People ask us all the time, what's the last four of your Social Security number? Military at that time anyway, they always said, what's your MOS? And then you'd say 527 or something like that. So so they said, you're going to be in the Air Force. I said, ecstatic. I can't believe it. And then they said, you're going to be stationed at Patrick Air Force Base, Florida, which is a support base for the Cape. And that was unbelievably good. So this is the sign that we saw when we went there. Now, in 2019, President Trump signed a bill that started the fifth arm of the forces, and it's called U.S. Space Force, Patrick Space Force Base. See, the air has just been replaced by space. So Holly and I jumped in the car and we went to our new home. So the mainland of Florida is over there. This is a lagoon. If you're going to have this is a barrier island. Barrier islands are made by hundreds of thousands of years of waves and tides washing up, and it's all sand. But between that and the mainland, you must have a body of water for it to be called a barrier island. So we're sitting in a helicopter now, and we're looking down toward Patrick Air Force Base. Miami, Florida is 196 miles there, and 376 miles down there is Havana, Cuba. And that made a big difference a year later, because a year later we had the Cuban crisis, and then the Cape and Patrick Air Force Base was within missile range of Cuba. If they'd have gotten the missiles set on the pads, they already had the pads. This base then changed. We were covered up with Marines, and we had so many planes parked down there that you couldn't get by. So if we drive on, we go down this little highway that's called A1A, and probably a lot of you have been on it. And this is the living area here. About 60-70% of the people who lived there worked on the Cape, and the rest maintained the base. This is a business part of the base, where the base commander has his office, the hospital is, the BX, etc. My oldest daughter, Melissa, was born right there. And so, then here are the airstrips. Now, when I got there, I was next to the lowest ranking officer, and I had no children. So I qualified only for the smallest number of square feet. So there's 4 buildings here. Those aren't houses, those are duplexes. I had the south half of that, and right in the backyard there is my wedding ring. I took it off. It was 3 years old. I took it off to swing some golf clubs, lost it in the St. Augustine grass, could not find it, and it's still there, I think. So here are pine trees. Now, if you walk right through those pine trees, go across A1A, you're at the Officers Club. See the beach chairs out there? And you could join the Officers Club for $7.30 a month. A mixed drink was 25 cents, except on Friday afternoon when you got 2 for 25 cents. It was a heck of a deal. So now we're looking south. Now we're going to turn around and we're going to go look north. Now we're looking north. Now we see 2 barrier islands, one here and one here. Now this is the one that Patrick Air Force Base is on. So you come up here, see this jut out here? That allows you to call it a cape. You can't call anything a cape unless it has a point on it. All the capes along the East Coast, almost all of them, Cape Cod, etc., have a lighthouse, or used to have a lighthouse, so the ships don't run into them. That lighthouse was built in 1842, cost $13,000 and 65 feet tall. So I'm only going to talk to you about from Apollo down, because that's all was there when I was there. All these others are proprietary. United launched an alliance. If you want your own personal satellite, you got enough millions, they'll put it up there for you, unless it's threatening. Here's Elon Musk's SpaceX Falcon 9. There's ULA again, Elon Musk again, and this is the NASA's proprietary arm called Space Launch System. This wasn't there when I was there. The shuttle landing facility was not there. This is called Merritt Island. On the upper end of Merritt Island is an animal preserve, and see that wild boar, a feral boar, they have 2,000 there, and they harvest 1,200 each year to keep the population sustainable at 2,000. So now we have NASA. So now we need something to do in a hurry. So NASA cooks up 5 projects, and they're well thought out, I thought. We'll talk about the first 3. The 4th one I won't talk about because it's Skylab. In 1973 and 74, I wasn't there. At tremendous cost, we put Skylab up there and then abandoned it after 2 years because we were going to be, first of all, it was taking too much money, too much time, and we would rather be a part of the International Space Station. Then the 5th project was the shuttle, the space shuttle. You can tell what it's supposed to do if you change the word shuttle to truck. It was a space truck. It was supposed to take like 25 tons up to these labs. It's not designed to go to the moon. So now here's project number 1. It was first of all named Project Astronaut, and Eisenhower again said that's the wrong name. It's too much emphasis on that man. Let's have another name. So they came up with Mercury, which is a Greek god of speed. He's a messenger to the other Greek gods with a little g. And if you see him in ancient paintings, he'll have a wing on each side of his head and a wing on each foot. So this is the space capsule right here. This is the famous and infamous hatch we'll talk about. So here's the first part of the program. We're going to use a Redstone rocket named after Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. The ground and the stones there are red colored, so that's hence the name. The second part of the program is going to be Atlas rockets. This doesn't have enough thrust to put people in orbit. It can shoot you up like a shot put into space and then come back down. And the Atlas, though, has enough thrust, it can put you into space. So why don't we just use this one the whole time? Because it wasn't finished yet, that's why. And we were in a race with the Russians, so we do what we can. So the plan was to have 20 uncrewed developmental flights, some with animals. So we'll see in a minute, we put up 2 chimps, and to put an astronaut into space before the USSR, that didn't work. They beat us. So now, here's the Redstone missile family. Now, these start right here and they go across every couple of years. That's not like a cards and old maid that you can pick out the rocket that you want. For instance, this is the first one that they made at Redstone. It was kind of like a V2 on steroids. And then they got Jupiter C, and then here's Juno 1 with that green bracket around it. Juno 1 was the one that was used for that Explorer 1 in 1958. And then here's the Mercury Redstone. That's the one we're going to put astronauts into space, but not into orbit. See, there's a space capsule right there. So now where we're going to shoot, where we're going to practice, and where we're going to shoot these things. So here is Cape Canaveral. So we're going to shoot right along a line like that, and we're going to aim right toward the southern tip of Africa. We're not going to hit Africa because it's over 8,000 miles away. Why did they pick out that line? Because there's several little islands along there, and they could put radar stations on those islands. There were no overhead satellites, so otherwise, when the missile went out of your sight, you didn't know where it went. So now they'd have radar stations there. But now when you want to put a man there, you swing that up 30 degrees. Now you're shooting over Bermuda toward the Canary Islands over Morocco. The reason they wanted to do that was a part of a whole system that went clear around the globe, 16 of them. But if something was happening, they could pick it up at this one, and they could abort, and they could land here in the sea just before they got to Canary Islands, and they'd have ships there to pick them up. The reason I put this here is because one of the guys who was in the Navy said, just beyond our territorial waters, in international waters, always set 1 to 3 Russian ships, and they were covered up with the antennas. He said they looked like porcupines, and they were monitoring everything that went on at the Cape. Not only that, but the scary thing was that they knew our schedule, because if we weren't going to have a shot for 17 or 19 days, they would disappear, and then they'd come back the day before the next shot. And the reason I put this on here is because right there, once they're going to have a Polaris missile shot from a submerged nuclear sub. The first Polaris missile was shot in 1961 from a submerged position, so they wanted to do it again. This is spring of '63, but they wanted to come and shoot it down in the range that had the radar in it. So they were submerged here. So they sent a destroyer out because they were afraid a Russian ship would be there and maybe just sit over the top of the nuclear sub so it couldn't do anything. So the destroyer went out, and somehow I got a ride. I was the only blue coat on that besides sailors, and there were two guys with civilian suits who I thought were probably from the company that made the Polaris missile. So I had trouble with motion sickness, so I was okay going out on the destroyer. But then we had a 2-hour delay. Destroyer isn't that big of a ship, and so we're sitting there bobbing a little bit. And I'm getting greener and greener. So now I'm over the side of the destroyer hanging right close to the edge, so if I throw up, I can throw up out in the ocean, not on their deck. Because, I cannot, as an Air Force officer, throw up in front of the Navy. Just cannot do it. So eventually the shot went up, and it was absolutely amazing because they use a big air thrust to get the missile up to the top. They don't use explosives in the sub for fear of what happened. So they blast it up. It sits there for just a millisecond, and it's like right there, and all of a sudden it's gone. So now the missile's gone. And so now the destroyer's turning around about which time a sailor comes up to me and says, "Sir, the commander would like for you to join the other officers in the mess to eat." So now, and that was downstairs, no windows, smell of food, still moving around. And I thought, all right, if I go down there, I'm going to throw up on the table in front of all those sailors. So I said, would you give the commander my regrets? I'm in the Air Force and I rarely get out on the ocean, so I want to stay here and take it all in. And he looked at me and he said, "Yes, sir, I'll tell him that's what you said." In other words, he knew that was bull. So now we're going to construct one of these missiles to go up. This is the Redstone missile right here, and this is a connector device. Now there's the pad right there. They're going to stand on that pad. This big thing is called a gantry, Gantry. This is going to extend up through there for stability and also give people to work on it if they need to. Then after that gets stable like this, they put the ice cream dip on the cone. This is the space capsule here. So now here's another look at the gantry. Now this is actually Alan Shepard's shot that's going the first American that ever went into space. And the gantry you see has moved away. It's on rails here. And it's on rails, so when it's here, it'll be in specifically the right spot, straddling that pad right there. He's already launched. So there's an elevator that goes up here, an elevator that goes up here. This is the astronaut, or the 11th level, they call it. The next level is the 12th level. I got to ride up and then got out on the 12th level, and it's we get out of the elevator. It's just a little 1-foot thing there. I didn't like that a whole lot. So now we're going to look at the Mercury spacecraft. Some of the guys are maybe like this if you're kind of techie. But if you take this off, the rocket, this is the rocket, that's the connector. Take this off and set it over here in large. This is the retro package here. Now the retro package is right there, and here's a picture of it right there. The next thing up is the heat shield. The heat shield is what keeps the astronaut alive because it picks up 3,000 degrees of heat Fahrenheit. And so that's a picture of it here. And here it is here, that kind of copper look. Now the next thing, and I want to show you one thing now because it's important. You see this retro pack is hooked onto the heat shield. These straps do not hook onto the heat shield. They go around and hooked onto the capsule right there. That'll become important later. And so now here is where the astronaut sits from here to here. Here's his little hat skin. The astronaut's back is parallel here with the ground. His hips are then bent 90 degrees, and his knees are bent 90 degrees. So he's in what's called the 90-90 position. So, but his back is right against that, and that runs from here to here. Now, there are 3 chutes. One called a drogue chute, which is 6 feet in diameter, and the other one is the regular chute, which is 63 feet in diameter, which is about 4 times as wide as a normal pilot's chute. This thing right here is a communication device to Earth. And this thing right here is called the LES, the Launch Escape System. It's 17 feet tall and weighs 660 pounds. What it functions for, if they have a malfunction, and the astronaut in here can detect this isn't going right, he can hit a button. And this is hooked onto here with what they call explosive bolts. So all the bolts are immediately dissolved, and then these 3 solid state rockets fire. This is solid state matter. There's 3 of them there, and it takes him up and away. So he'll land over here with his parachutes about 3 miles away. It's hard to tell here, but this doesn't go straight up. It bends a little bit that way, so it takes him away. And the other thing, if the astronaut fails and doesn't push this fast enough, there are sensors in here that can detect a malfunction, and so it'll go off. So let's look at this just a bit. This is a retro package. So this thing's orbiting the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour. It's going. And so it has to be slowed up a little bit to come back in the Earth. So they have to fire the retro rockets. These are the 3 retro rockets. This one fires first. They don't fire all at one time because it would put so many G's on the astronaut that he couldn't take it. So this one fires for 10 seconds. And after 5 seconds, this one fires. And after that one's been firing 5 seconds, this one fires. They go bang, bang, bang. So that's if you're driving a car and you fire your retro rockets, what you've done is step on the brakes. So now, if you're in your car and you want to go faster, you do this, this, this. And that they burn all at one time, but only 1 second, because they're weak enough that they can do that. So now we're going to get some people off this pad, and all these guys wanted to be first in space. They couldn't decide who was going to be first in space, so they had a vote, which seemed to me like an awful lot like a personality contest, but they all voted, and the brass in the Mercury program had a vote too. I thought that John Glenn would win, and I didn't know John Glenn, but he got most of the publicity as seen before they went up. But Alan Shepard got it first, and Gus Grisham from Indiana, Mitchell, Indiana, he got second. He's a graduate of Purdue, a degree in engineering. And so Alan Shepard is going to go up, but not until these guys go up. This guy right here is Ham, and that's an acronym, stands for Holloman Aerospace Medicine. They got 40 chimps, and they trained them all to follow orders. And so when they do a certain light, they would have to do something. The reason they were doing that is because nobody's been in space. So could you think in space? Could you move your hands in space? How was your dexterity? How was your eyesight? So they gave him things to do, and then if he didn't do it right, it buzzed his leg. So they said it does not hurt him, just tells him he screwed up. So he did a good job, and then Enos was going to go up, and Enos was going to do John Glenn's. He was going to have 3 orbits around the Earth. But after 2 orbits, the air conditioning failed, just like it did for the USSR, and his body temperature was over 100, so they aborted and brought him back. But the reason he was a hero, he did 76 orders, and he did every one of them right. And each time after he did one of them right, he got a buzz on his leg. It was an error. He told him he screwed up. So how would that make you feel? You keep doing it right, keep being told you did it wrong. So now this guy, Alan Shepard's going to go up. And he was a smart kid. He skipped the 6th and 8th grade. He qualified to go into the Naval Academy when he was 16, but they wouldn't, because of rules, he couldn't do it, so he went in at 17. And so, but oddly enough, he finished in the middle of his class. Out of 900 students, he was 463, which is kind of funny. But he was a great pilot, and he went to their test pilot school and became a pilot in their test pilot school. So now he's in this space capsule, waiting to be fired. They didn't make any provisions for urination or defecation because his flight was only going to take 15 minutes and 28 seconds. Everybody can hold it for 15 minutes and 28 seconds, except if there's a 4-hour delay. So now he's in there, lying on his back. They're in a seat. They call it their couch, and their couches are all, of course, custom made for them. And so he's lying there, and he's really got to pee. And so now they have dignitaries out there watching. They have TV internationally on him, and so the gantry has been moved away. So he thought about, can I tell him to bring the gantry back? And so he finally decided, I'm just going to pee. So his chest was covered up with sensors for his heart, and his back was covered up with sensors for respiratory, and he had a 4-inch rectal probe in his butt. They all had to have that except the last guy. The last guy, by the time they were able to do it orally, but they all hated the rectal probe the most, as you can imagine. So now he's lying on his back, his hip at 90 degrees, and he starts peeing. So it runs between his legs and is running up between his skin and his custom-made couch. And then it's shorting out all his sensors on his back. And he said his panel in front of him is lighting up, going crazy. So then at that time, Control Center comes on and said, "Oh, say, Alan," he said, "I couldn't hold it any longer." And they said, "That's exactly what we thought." And they turned it all off, so he had no sensors. But anyway, he came down and rest time did a great job. So the next guy is going to go up is Gus Grisham. Gus had heard about his problems with urination. So he said he put on 2 pair of rubber shorts. And I don't know what that means, but he didn't need it because he didn't have a delay. The thing that happened to Gus Grisham, it's kind of interesting. When he landed, he thought he heard water running into the capsule, which wasn't true. But then all of a sudden, the hatch blew off. And he had the first capsule that had an automatic blow on the capsule where he had bolts loaded that would blow off and the hatch would go off. Before that, they had to unscrew 70 of those, which was laborious and took too much time if the astronaut control. So all of a sudden, this hatch blows off. Now that makes water come in this capsule for sure. So there was only 3 ways that the hatch could blow. Number 1, Control Center could blow it. The astronaut in there could blow it. The astronaut designed what it was. They had a thing called a chicken switch. If you're a chicken, you hit the switch and it blew. And the third way is could be a malfunction. But he was suspect and doing it. The reason he was suspect was because his pulse was 168. The only reason your pulse gets 168 if you're exercising a lot or if you're very frightened. So they thought that may indicate he was very frightened and he inadvertently or advertently hit the chicken switch. He was eventually cleared of that and in fact went on to become quite a success. They thought that if Gus hadn't been killed in Apollo 1 accident, he probably would have been the man who walked on the moon and not Neil Armstrong. So now we're going to go on this road right here. We're going to go past all this and we're going to go up to Mercury. Now, same program, different rocket. And this is where Enos went from and 4 of the astronauts. So the 4 astronauts who went from there are from the left, Scott Carpenter, the next one's Gordon Cooper, the next one's John Glenn, and then switch down then to this guy, Wally Schropp. And I'll touch on some of those. The rocket they're going to use is this, the Atlas rocket. Again, these are not rockets that you can just select one. That you want to use the most powerful one available at that time. And that's this Atlas D rocket. Now you notice this was painted, that was painted, not painted, not painted, not painted, not painted, not painted on the rocket part. And I asked why, and they said because they don't want the added weight. Which I thought that sounded really ludicrous. With all that power, you don't want the weight of paint. They said that's right. So, but now they had a problem because when they put that on a pad and it was exposed to salty mist coming off the Atlantic Ocean, it rusted. Didn't want that. So then NASA put out a call to all the companies who do such thing and said, if you'd like to produce a product that we could spray on, be virtually weightless, and not let our rocket rust, we'll give you the contract. So a lot of companies worked on that, and here's what they came up with, is WD-40. It came out of San Diego. It stands for Water Displacement 40th Try. They got the contract, and I bet most of you have that in your garage. So now, we're going to go John Glenn going up. John Glenn is this guy right here. He was the oldest of the group at 37 when he went. He was from Ohio. After he quit being an astronaut, he went back and ran for the Senate and lost twice and then won. And he was a senator from Ohio for 24 years. Even though he was the oldest of these, he outlived them all. He died when he was 96 in 2016. So now he's going to go up. And the interesting thing about, he's going to orbit the Earth 3 times. Each orbit takes 88 minutes, going 18,000 miles an hour. So now he's going to have a problem, though. You know, remember there were 16 places around the Earth to monitor him. 8 of them got an indication that the heat shield was loose, and 8 of them got an indication the heat shield was not loose. If the heat shield was loose and fell off, he's dead. So they thought about what to do. So ordinarily, after the retro package fires here, to come back, they jettison that. These things release, and these fall off, and then the whole heat shield is exposed to the atmosphere. So what they came up with is let's leave the retro package on with these things, which luckily are attached to the capsule itself, and that will maybe keep the heat shield in place. So they did, and he came back in, and then about halfway through, he saw metallic things flying on fire, flying past the capsule. And what happened is the retro package just came apart, and then he had this. And when they checked the capsule, when he got down, it was not loose. It was never loose. So it was a worry that it didn't have to be. So the last guy I'm going to talk about going up is this guy, Gordon Cooper, who's from Murray, Kentucky, right here. And he was the youngest of all of them at 32, so they were pretty well bunched in age. So right before he was supposed to go up, he did what a risk taker would do. And then the astronauts, when they first came there, they had one jet stationed at Patrick Air Force Base, which they could call down and use when they wanted. Because they had to go to Houston some, they had to go to Atlanta some, at Alabama some, various places. And they complained about that. Two things. Number one, it wasn't enough planes, and two, it was too slow. And so they wanted 7 planes, so they could all fly anytime they wanted to. They finally got 3, and they got this F-102, I think it is. It is supersonic, but it came online in 1956, so it was probably only 6 years old. But it wasn't fast as what they wanted. But they had 3 of them now, so they could just call down and say, "Get my plane ready." So they did, and he was supposed to go up like in a couple of weeks. And so what a risk taker would do, he would buzz Hangar S. And Hangar S was where the astronauts had bunks, and they'd go and take a nap. They slept there the night before they were going to go up, and they had a couple of secretaries trying to answer pan mail, and it was that kind of thing. So he figured some of his buddies were going to take a nap, so he buzzed the hangar, got right on the roof, and then kicked in both afterburners. So he made a big boom. And so it's one thing to have a boom in Evansville. It's an entirely different thing to have a boom on the Cape, because there's things that go boom that will kill you. And everybody dove under their desk. And the people who were head of Mercury failed to see humor in that. So they were going to take away his ride. He wasn't going to get to go on his ride on Mercury. And they weren't going to kick him out, but they were going to make him work to Gemini. By the way, Gemini, I said Gemini, it's actually pronounced Gemini correctly. And NASA tried to make everybody pronounce it Gemini for a long time, and then gave up and started saying Gemini. But it's really Gemini. So anyway, he buzzed this, but he still got his ride. So now, the last guy I'm going to talk about is this guy right here, Deke Slayton. And he's got an X there, you notice, right there. And here he is. All these guys, they hate, all pilots hate physicians. And the reason they do, they think the only thing we're good for is to take away their flight privileges. If you take away one of those guys' flight privileges, you might as well take away the air that he breathes. I mean, that's the way it is. And plus, these guys didn't make near as much money as you might think. And the flight pay that they got was a significant part of their budget. So he got his physical by a NASA physician, and he was found to have a conduction defect in his heart, which is found in 1 to 4% of the population. And because of that, I don't even want to use the word defect. It was a conduction variance in his heart. And so he had his flying privileges taken away, and he could no longer go up in space. They eventually, and he couldn't fly this airplane. So they eventually said, okay, you can fly this airplane, but only if you have a fully qualified pilot in the second seat and not a navigator. So he did that. But he became very important in the program and handed out all the assignments. Somebody once said to him, Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, and he answered, the reason he was the first man to walk on the moon is because I chose him. So he was pretty strong on that. And so the final part of his story was in 1972, 10 years later, what he had wrong with his heart was then not listed as pathological, but listed as a variation of normal. So all of a sudden he got his flight privileges back and he could go in space. He was very bitter, and I would have been too, but because 10 years of his life was taken away. He eventually did go into space in 1975 in a combined Russian Apollo mission. So now the second project is named Gemini, and it's appropriate because Gemini in Greek means two, or twins. And so it's Project 2, and now there are 2 pilots. You know, we have 1 pilot in Mercury, 2 pilots in Gemini, and 3 pilots in Apollo. And they're going to use a bigger rocket, Titan II, and the missions, you see, it's varied because the you can tell the way it's on the island here. See, here's Space Launch Complex 14, and here's Space Launch Complex 34 Apollo. Gemini is between, and it actually is a bridge between those two. With Mercury, the only thing you want to do is put somebody up, see if you can get them down, and see if they can think, move their fingers. Now, they're going to have to do a lot more than that when they go to the moon. They're going to have to stay up 8 days for one thing. And so that's what Gemini was, to get that all set. So now we're getting to Project 3. This is Apollo, another Greek god, and this was going to go up by this humongous rocket. Look at that rocket. It's over 3,000 tons. It's in 3 sections. See this little thing right here? That's a full-size bus. It's amazing. They built 15 of those. 13 have been used, and 2 of them are in mothballs. So now in Apollo 1, this is where Gus Grissom got killed. He was sitting right in this capsule right here with 2 other guys, Ed White and somebody else. I can't think of his name. But anyway, it wasn't even a shot. It was a practice. And so his buddy, Schraub, called him the night before he was going to get in there and said, Gus, I have a lot of bad feelings about that capsule. I think we've gotten lax on taking care of these capsules, and I don't think you ought to get in there. And Gus blew it off and said, oh, it'll be fine. When he got in, you know what they do? They exhaust all the air in a capsule, which is 21% oxygen. They put 100% oxygen in. 100% oxygen, anything will cause a fire. Even oil on your shoes will cause a fire. They didn't want to use a Velcro clasp because pulling the Velcro might cause an explosion. So eventually they burned to death because of an explosion in there. And it was a short in wiring. So it was a man-made defect, and it cost them their life. So let's look at the thrust improvements here that's going on. Now this is a V2 in Germany. It had 55,000 foot-pounds of thrust. The Redstone, which put people in space but not in orbit, 75,000. The Atlas put people in orbit, it's 360,000 total. The reason I have total there because now we're having more than one engine on those. The Titan had 530,000 total, but look at this monster. Apollo Saturn had 9,138,50 pounds thrust. JFK was really into these programs, and so he gave a talk at Brooke Air Force Base in San Antonio on a Friday night, and he announced the Saturn, that we have now bypassed anything that the USSR has. This is the best rocket in the world. He gave that talk on Friday night, and then he and Jackie got up Saturday morning and drove to Dallas, and were in the parade where he got assassinated. So I got to tell you this one last story, and I'll quit. You see whether you believe this or not. The guy told me this who lived near me. He was an engineer, worked on the Cape, and he was a graduate of Notre Dame. So Notre Dame people probably don't lie, right? So anyway, he told me one time that he said, even though for a while we didn't have enough thrust to put people in space, but he said we weren't ready anyway because we couldn't hit our window in space. So I said, what do you mean your window in space? He said, if you can picture a bedroom window, a rectangle bedroom window, and it's way up there, we have to be able to put a rocket through that window at the right speed and the right inclination every time. We never miss left or right. We always miss higher or lower or hit the window. He said if we miss with enough thrust, the astronaut will go irretrievably in space, and he'll die as soon as his oxygen and food runs out. If we miss low, he will not ever get in space, and he'll land 3,000 or 4,000 miles out in the ocean, and there'll be nobody out there to save him. So you need to hit that window every time. So they could not figure out why they couldn't hit the window. And finally some engineers started plotting their misses. So it turned out they weren't random misses. When they plotted them and then drew this line, they formed a sine curve like this. Every time this crosses, it was a hit. Everything else was a miss. But I'm not an engineer, but so he was saying as soon as they get a sine wave or sine curve, they know they have a solvable problem. They don't have the solution, but they have a solvable problem. So then they try to put every possible thing they could into their formula to see why that was like that. Until finally somebody put in the status of the tides. Where were the tides? As soon as they started figuring that, they could hit the window every time. And what he said they found out is when the tide comes in, it moves that island 6 feet closer to the mainland. When it goes out, it moves 6 feet back out. So he said it's like a baseball pitcher throwing the plate. If you move the mound every time he tries to shoot, he's not going to be very accurate. As soon as they got their exact location in space, they could hit the window every time. So I said, did the Russians have to figure that out too? Because they've hit the space an awful lot of times. And he said, no, they didn't have to figure it out because they fire from solid ground. Now here's the Russian place right here. You notice it's not in Russia, it's in Kazakhstan. But this was built in 1955 when the USSR was a firm thing. Kazakhstan had no choice about that. So they wanted, and so they built that in 1955. We found out about it in 1957 with illegal U-2 surveillance flights. They wanted to shoot here for 3 reasons. Number one, there's a thing right here called a steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E. It's a 5,000-mile pasture, wide pasture that runs from Mongolia to Austria. And so they wanted to fire with that because nothing, no mountains would block their communications. And their first astronauts, bailed out. They didn't land in the ocean. So they wanted a good place for them to bail out. And also they didn't want to, see, this is Russia, here's China, and here are all the SPAN countries. So they didn't want to fire over China in 1955 for fear China, with an ICBM, for fear China would think it's an offensive weapon and fire back. So that was the reason that they didn't have, it's all dry ground, so they didn't have to figure that out. So here's how that looks. Here's the Kazakh steppe. See that? It's a great place to bail out too. So, in summary, it's a risky business. And so since 1960 to 1924, 19 astronaut fatalities during space flights. 4 of those were Russians. They got Russian stats in there. The astronaut fatalities while training, for example, Apollo 1. Non-astronaut fatalities like the person who got killed in the block building, for a total of 108 total fatalities over a 60-year period, 64 year period. So about 3 per year. So it's a risky business. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.